And yeah, today I'm going to be presenting some of the work I did this summer in the General Service Administration's Office of Customer Experience, and how I helped them sort of bring a new form of longer form content to a platform called Digital.gov. So, share my screen. Um, so if you guys have seen any government website, and in particular, some of these ones hosted by the General Service Administration, you might notice there's some common themes. So these are all sites that are sort of under the domain of this platform called Digital.gov that hosts sort of this longer form guide content. So they're all giving you information about things like the Paperwork Reduction Act and plain language and accessibility, super important topics, but they're all hosted on sort of separate websites, separate domains. They're all navigated in different ways. Um, they all have different like branding and technical like infrastructure underneath them, which is not ideal for the digital gov team that's trying to maintain all these different sites. So what they want to do is bring all of these sites onto their one platform called digital.gov. Um, but the problem with this is that their current way of doing this was pretty outdated. Um, so on the right here, you can see one of their existing guides um, that was sort of using this template that they wanted to use for their other content, but it had a couple problems. So on the technical side, the code was pretty old, it was very redundant, it was hard to maintain, um, and just generally not great to work with. And then on the content side, um, the main issue was that it couldn't support all these sections of content that the subsites would need it to support. Um, so you can see here over on the left, there's maybe only up to like 8 sections of content, whereas some of the content that we were going to be migrating was hundreds of pages long and wouldn't sort of fit in this template. Um, so what I was tasked with doing this summer was making a new template for DigitalGov to sort of publish this longer form guide content from all of these different subsites. So it needed to have like a very distinct visual look and feel, while also being like customizable enough to support tons of different types of content and easily navigable enough um, so that people can go through the content without getting too lost. Of course, it also needs to be technically like maintainable and robust so that people can keep using it after I leave. Um, so here's sort of the little before and after shot of the initial solution. So before starting to migrate some new content over, I had to redesign all of their existing guides. So this one was a guide to the digital analytics program. You can see before on the left and after on the right, featuring again this new sort of visual identity. So it has this nice, pretty image, kicker, title, summary, as well as more importantly, redesign navigation. So the navigation sort of moved up to this top menu bar and sticks when you scroll, so you can sort of continuously navigate through all these different sections. So this is great. And now if you go to Digital.gov, all of their guides should look like this, which is pretty exciting. Um, but it wasn't really anything new. And the real reason I was sort of brought on was for something called the Human-Centered Design Guides, which is something that my host office, the Office of Customer Experience, as well as the Office of Personnel Management, had collaborated on to create sort of this guide series about human-centered design and everything you need to know about it. So these guides were currently living in Google Doc form, and they're pretty gigantic. There's over 200 pages of content across 4 different guides. There's 4 more actually still in development. So it was a pretty good candidate for seeing if this new template could support longer form content. And turns out it couldn't really, or at least until I added a bunch of new features. Um, so I'm not going to go through all of these today because we would be here for a minute. But basically, some of the big ones were like adding a landing page so that people had sort of a central place to go and start from before diving into the guides, redesigning the menu bar, as well as adding things like a glossary so people could look up terms and side navigation um, so that people can navigate within longer pages. Um, and also all these other things here on the right. Um, so to go through some of those more in depth, one of the big things was adding sort of a landing page component. So this has, again, distinct sections for featured resources, as well as additional resources and like an introduction to the content, and creates this central place where you can get acclimated to what these guides are going to be about and easily navigate between them. This is also going to form, a little sneak peek, for future pages on Digital.gov. They're going to use this template to create other sorts of like compilation pages where they're compiling different sorts of resources. I also added a new sort of side navigation component. So you might have noticed this is where that old navigation was on that old template. Because the primary navigation moved up to this top menu bar, that made room for exponentially more layers of content that you can get to using this side navigation. So this allows you to navigate within multiple pages within a singular section, as well as within a page. You can sort of navigate by clicking on different headers, and it'll scroll you right to where you need to be. And then lastly, I added this sort of glossary component. So this is a fun little feature to sort of make accessing terms that might be unfamiliar a lot easier and more seamless than maybe navigating to a totally separate page. This is just a drawer that slides out from the right side of the page with a bunch of different collapsible terms that you can search from and filter and hopefully find what you're looking for much easier. And those were all the big ones. There were also lots of smaller things that I added, like previous and next buttons and buttons for featured resources and new types of tables and reading times, as well as different ways to sort of break up the content. So particularly when you're like reading pages and pages and pages of content, it can be helpful to have sort of key ideas or quotes, things like that called out. So I created a whole bunch of new components to highlight that as well. So here's sort of a little demo of what the solution looks like. This is the landing page, which allows you to click into a guide, as well as this glossary component here, which allows you to search for different terms. And then within the guide, you can use this side navigation here to sort of navigate within different sections. So yeah, it does work, hopefully. And this is sort of what it looks like when it's all complete and done. So the impact of this, first of all, it allowed for all 6 of the existing guides on Digital.gov to be migrated to a new, more modern template with much better, more maintainable code underlying it. It also allowed us to migrate these 200 pages of human-centered design content onto the internet and into this new template. And then going forward, like I was saying at the beginning, this will hopefully allow a bunch of these other sites that are conveying a bunch of the same content to use one singular template and make maintaining that a lot easier. A couple of things I learned through doing this. One of them was just sort of to break up the work you were doing. So here's some big scary numbers of like the amount of code I changed. And initially when I presented this to the team, they were very sort of hesitant to integrate it because it was such a big change. It was taking a long time to get reviewed and actually integrated. So instead, I learned to sort of break up the work into much smaller pull requests that could be reviewed more quickly and seemed less intimidating to the team, even though the same changes were being made. Just making them more incrementally made it a lot more approachable. And then in addition to that, just being very open to change, being flexible. Over the course of my 10 weeks, I got like over 200 like suggestions on all the things I've done. and that number is still going up. As well as just like 8 things that were like, nah, they'd flat out rejected. But that was fine, and it definitely taught me to grow as sort of like a programmer. It made the code ultimately a lot more functional, more stable, as well as more accessible, as all these people had different ideas about how to use the template that I might not have thought of to begin with. Definitely just remaining flexible as well was the other big thing that I learned. Um, and that's all I had. I wanted to say a huge thank you to all of these people um, who helped support me through this project. I think some of them are hopefully here in this breakout room. Um, they, yeah, just did so much work in supporting me technically, and also just as someone very new to this sort of work, I really couldn't have done this without them. So I think I just saw the message, but thank you everyone. If anyone has any questions, I can answer those.
Jackson, do you mind if I answer the question that's in the chat right now, since I was
Oh
here?
yeah, I was not watching the chat.
Right on. So Eric asks, was there any user research that informed how much content your users usually read in a given session? Thanks for the question, Eric. So my name's Anna Monroe. I was Jackson's supervisor this summer, and your answer is more complicated than the question seems to indicate. So the primary use case for the guides, or the primary platform for the guides, was actually print. To date, that has been delivered via print to over 2,000 feds. We know for a fact it's in use right now throughout the federal government and agencies like the CDC and the Department of Veterans Affairs. No, the VA, the Veterans Administration. My bad. The digital versions were in beta for years and years, hanging out on the lab at OPM's GitHub. They were super broken. Jackson, I'm embarrassed that you ever saw them. So this format on Digital.gov will be really our first foray into realistically gathering numbers and understanding how much content people consume at a time, but it's slightly complicated by the fact that the guides are not designed or intended to be read all the way through long form. You're supposed to go in and look at the pieces and see which ones you need guidance on, which ones you need support on, and consume them bite by bite as opposed to linearly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I thought the answer might be complicated. I appreciate it.
For sure.
I see there's another question here about using like an open source design system. So yeah, that was another thing that was definitely very central to this work, was making sure that, yeah, it was in line with and consistent with a bunch of the other federal web content. So in particular, we adopted the US web design system, which was already in use on digital.gov. So a lot of those components that you're seeing for like buttons, in-page navigation, side navigation, images, that's all sort of using the US web design system as a framework because that's been tested and used across the government. So we're super, yeah, um, lucky to be able to use that in our production code. And everything that Digital.gov does actually is open source. So you can check out their GitHub repo to see all of the code underlying it. But yeah, a lot of that is built on USWDS.
Hey Jackson, it's nice to see you again. I know at the beginning of the program during the orientation, you were very nervous to like jump on this project because you're considering about any like future plans that you might have in CS. Just wanted to say that I think that you did a really phenomenal job, and it's really great to see you grow as a programmer. And yeah, I'm excited to see what the future holds for you.
Oh, you're so nice. Thank you. Great to see you too.
Jackson, I have a question, and I couldn't
Yeah.
find the raise hand feature, so I apologize, Joshua, if I'm jumping in line ahead of you. Do you want to go first? Okay. So I noticed that you used that kind of subnav, horizontal subnav for the guides. And I was wondering, just technical question, how did you implement that? Because I had a group use this same visual layout for a report that I put out last year or earlier this year. And that was kind of a tricky tricky dance. So I was wondering, just technically, how did you do that one?
For the horizontal one or the vertical one? Sorry.
The horizontal.
Yeah. So that was definitely quite the challenge, and in particular, making it accessible on both, large desktop screens as well as mobile screens. Um, Without getting like super into the technical details, it's basically using like a flexible Flexbox container that can scroll so that when there's overflowing content, it just scrolls sort of out of the way. And then there's some JavaScript code that identifies what section is currently selected and automatically scrolls to whatever section that might be. So yeah, that sort of allowed us to make, one horizontal thing that remained at the top at the same height, and that would just sort of scroll nicely when there was overflowing content. So you can, have as many sections as you want. And for full transparency, that was definitely not my idea. This was heavily inspired by the USWS Next component, which uses a very similar like horizontal nav. And yeah, I'd be happy to share the code for that as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's what we were copying too.
Yeah, it's a great inspiration. Well, thank you everyone. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the presentation.